the sultry, fevered autumn of 1851, the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans hosted an event that defies every known principle of economic logic and human behavior, a macabre mystery that historians have whispered about for over a century. In the center of the rotunda, beneath the grand dome, where fortunes were traded like playing cards, a woman known only as Amara was placed on the auction block. She was described by the few surviving witnesses not merely as beautiful, but as unearthly, possessing a gaze that silenced the raucous crowd of cotton kings and sugar barons. Yet, the official auction ledger, a heavy, leather-bound volume now kept in a climate-controlled vault, tells a story that science cannot explain. According to the ink-stained pages, this single woman was sold and returned 12 times in the span of 6 short months. Each time, her price increased, and each time, the buyer returned her within days, shaken, pale, and refusing to speak of what had occurred within their walls. What dark secret could be so terrifying that the wealthiest families in the South would willingly forfeit thousands of dollars just to remove this woman from their homes? Why did the official records of St. Landry Parish suddenly go dark regarding her final sale to the state's most powerful senator? The answers lie buried in a fragmented trail of destroyed diaries, sealed court documents, and a lineage of ruin that struck anyone who dared to claim ownership of her. This is not just a story of the antebellum South. It is a chronicle of a moral haunting, a reckoning that proved that some secrets are too dangerous to be kept, and some people are too powerful to be owned. Before we open the pages of the Red Ledger and expose the truth behind the most impossible sale in Louisiana history, if you are fascinated by the mysteries that the history books refuse to teach, subscribe to Before the Story, enable notifications, and like this video. Let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The narrative landscape of 1851 Louisiana was a world of contradictions, where the oppressive humidity of the bayou clashed with the gilded opulence of the aristocracy. In the heart of New Orleans, the St. Louis Hotel stood as the cathedral of this commerce, a place where the scent of expensive cigars mingled with the damp, earthy smell of the river. It was here, under the soaring dome of the rotunda, that the state's elite gathered to flaunt their wealth in human terms. But the season of 1851 was marked by an anomaly that would eventually be scrubbed from the city's polite conversation. The records from that year, specifically the Ledger of Human Property Volume 4, contain a series of entries that deviate sharply from standard accounting practices. The handwriting of the auctioneer, Jean-Baptiste Muir, usually precise and flowing, becomes erratic, almost frantic, on the pages dedicated to Lot 402. The entry introduces a woman named simply Amara. There is no surname, no plantation of origin, and no description of her skills, only the notation of her physical appearance, which Muir catalogued with an unusual mix of reverence and unease. Subject possesses a constitution of rare quality, the ledger notes, but maintains a silence that unsettles the other stock. Unlike other individuals forced onto the block who showed fear or despair, contemporary accounts suggest Amara stood with a terrifying stillness. She did not weep, she did not plead. She simply observed the men bidding on her with an expression that one observer described in a letter to his wife as the look of a judge watching a hanging. This stillness was the first sign that something was fundamentally wrong, a deviation from the expected order that went unnoticed by the men blinded by her aesthetic value. The atmosphere inside the rotunda during her first sale was electric, charged with a tension that seasoned traders could not identify. The bidding war was not driven by need, but by a competitive hysteria, a desire to possess what was rumored to be the finest specimen ever brought to market. Yet looking back through the lens of history, the obsession seems almost pathological. Men who were known for their financial prudence threw caution to the wind, driving the price to astronomical heights that defied the market rates of the era. They were not buying labor, they were buying prestige. They were buying a trophy that they believed would cement their status at the top of Louisiana's rigid social hierarchy. None of them suspected that they were inviting a Trojan horse into their sanctuaries, a force that would dismantle their lives from the inside out. The first purchaser documented in the ledger was Henri Duguay, a cotton magnate whose fortune was as vast as it was rapidly acquired. The transaction is recorded in dry ink. Sold for $5,200 to H. Duguay. Transfer immediate. Duguay, a man known for his brash confidence and lack of superstition, reportedly laughed when a rival bidder warned him about the woman's strange demeanor. He saw only the envy in their eyes, not the warning in the silence of the room. As he led Amara away from the podium, witnesses claimed the air in the rotunda grew suddenly cold, a phantom chill that settled in the marrow of the bones despite the sweltering October heat. This climatic anomaly was dismissed at the time as a draft, but it appears in 3 separate diary entries from that day. Dugay's carriage ride back to his estate on the outskirts of the city marks the beginning of the phenomenon. His personal journals, which survived only because they were confiscated during later bankruptcy proceedings, describe an immediate shift in the atmosphere of his household. He writes of a heaviness descending upon the rooms, a sensation of being watched even when alone. He notes that the dogs, usually aggressive and loyal, retreated to the furthest corners of the property and refused to bark. The servants, too, fell into a hushed, nervous rhythm, avoiding the new arrival not out of disdain, but out of an instinctual preservation. Amara was given quarters near the main house, a placement that signaled her status as a high-value acquisition, yet she never occupied them in the way a person occupies a home. Instead of resting or working, Amara began a behavior that would become her signature in every house she entered. She would stand perfectly still in specific rooms, staring at a particular section of a wall, a floorboard, or a piece of furniture. She did not speak. She did not point. She simply directed her gaze with an intensity that forced those around her to look where she looked. Duguay initially interpreted this as insolence or simple-mindedness. He ordered her to work, to move, to acknowledge his authority, but his commands seemed to dissolve before they reached her. In his diary, the arrogance of the master begins to crack, replaced by the confusion of a man who realizes his power has no effect on the object of his domination. On the 3rd day of her presence in the Duguay household, the silence broke. It was not Amara who spoke, but the house itself. Duguay returned home to find his wife, a woman of delicate constitution who rarely involved herself in his affairs, standing in the nursery with a crowbar in her hands. She had torn open the wall that Amara had been staring at for 48 hours. Behind the plaster and the lath, hidden in a dusty recess that had been sealed for years, was a cache of letters and a small, distinct locket. These were not random artifacts. They were concrete proof of Dugay's second family, a mistress and children he had kept hidden in a separate parish, financed by the dowry of the very wife who now held the evidence. The revelation was absolute and devastating. The illusion of the happy, prosperous Duguay marriage evaporated in an instant, destroyed not by a rumor, but by physical proof that had been inexplicably located by a stranger who had never set foot in the house before. Dugay's rage was catastrophic, but it was impotent against the facts. He could not punish Amara, for she had done nothing but look at a wall. She had violated no rule, broken no law, spoken no word of insubordination. She had simply acted as a living compass for the truth that he had buried. The scandal that followed would ruin his social standing, but the immediate reaction was even more telling. Henri Duguay returned Amara to the St. Louis Hotel the very next morning. The ledger entry is curt, written in a hand that shakes visibly. Returned. Defect in character. Incompatible with domestic peace. He forfeited a portion of his payment, a financial loss he accepted gladly just to have her gone. He did not ask for a refund. He asked for an exorcism of her presence. The traders at the rotunda whispered that Duguay had lost his mind, that he had discarded a fortune over a trifle. They did not know that he was merely the first domino in a chain reaction that was about to sweep through the grandest parlors of Louisiana. The return of such a valuable asset should have lowered her market value, yet the laws of economics inverted. When Amara was placed back on the block, the bidding was even more ferocious. The rumors of Dugay's sudden domestic collapse had spread, but perversely, they added a layer of mystique to her. The second buyer was the wealthy sugarcane planter, Louis Fontenot, a man who prided himself on his skepticism and rationalism. He believed Duguay to be a weak-willed fool and saw an opportunity to acquire a legendary beauty at a slight discount. The ledger records the sale at $5,500, a sum that raised eyebrows even among the most extravagant spenders. Fontenot took his prize to his sprawling estate upriver, confident that his iron-fisted management style would curb any defects in character. The Fontenot estate was a fortress of order, built on the backs of 300 enslaved souls and maintained with brutal efficiency. Fontenot's diary, preserved in the archives of Tulane University, documents his initial satisfaction. He describes Amara as docile, noting that she moved with a grace that elevated the aesthetic of his household. However, the tone of the entries shifts dramatically within 48 hours. He begins to complain of a miasma in the air, a sense of suffocating pressure that seemed to radiate from the woman's presence. He notes that she refused to sleep in the quarters assigned to her, choosing instead to stand in the center of the manicured rose garden, staring fixedly at a patch of disturbed earth beneath an ancient oak tree. The staff, sensitive to the unseen currents of the plantation, gave Amara a wide berth. They whispered that she walked with the old spirits, that she was not entirely of this world. Fontenot dismissed these superstitions with the contempt of a man of science, but he could not ignore the behavior of his own family. His youngest daughter, a child of 6, began to speak of the crying baby in the garden, a sound she claimed to hear only when she stood near the silent woman. The distress of the child, coupled with the unnerving stillness of Amara, began to erode Fontenot's patience. He threatened Amara with the whip, demanding she move away from the tree. She turned her gaze upon him, and for the first time, Fontenot felt the true weight of her presence, a judgment so profound it made his hand tremble. The climax of the Fontenot tenure occurred on a Sunday morning, as the family prepared for Mass. Fontenot's wife, driven by a hysterical compulsion she could later not explain, ordered the gardener to dig up the rosebush Amara had been watching. Fontenot forbade it, but the order had been given, and the gardener, terrified of the mistress's manic state, drove his spade into the soil. 3 feet down, wrapped in a decaying linen sack, they found the skeletal remains of an infant. It was not a slave child, as might have been tragically common, but a baby wrapped in a blanket embroidered with the Fontenot crest, the result of a secret indiscretion Fontenot had committed with a governess years prior, a child he had personally buried to protect his reputation. The discovery shattered the Fontenot dynasty. The screams of his wife echoed across the manicured lawns, a sound of betrayal that no amount of wealth could silence. Fontenot stood paralyzed, the shovel lying at his feet like an accusation. Amara stood a few yards away, her face impassive, her duty discharged. She had not dug the hole. She had not pointed a finger. She had simply illuminated the darkness where the sin lay hidden. The mechanism of her power was becoming clear. She did not bring the chaos. She merely removed the shadows that concealed it. She was a mirror in which the moral rot of her owners was reflected with unbearable clarity. Fontenot, a man broken by the exposure of his darkest crime, returned Amara to the rotunda the next day. The ledger entry for this return is even more cryptic than the first. Returned, unsuitable, bad omen. He accepted a $1,000 loss on the transaction, a desperate fee paid to rid himself of the witness to his guilt. The auctioneer, Jean-Baptiste Mur, began to look at lot 402 with a growing sense of dread. He cleaned the page, re-inked his pen, and prepared to sell her again, but the whispers in the rotunda had turned from envy to fear. Yet, greed is a powerful anesthetic. The third buyer, a judge from Baton Rouge named Etienne Leclerc, believed that he possessed the moral fortitude to handle whatever curse afflicted this woman. He was a man of the law, a pillar of rectitude who believed that order could be imposed on any chaos. He purchased Amara for $5,800, convinced that the previous owners were simply men of weak conscience. He brought her into a home that was a temple of legalism, where every book was balanced and every rule was followed. But Judge Leclerc had forgotten that the law and justice are not always the same thing, and his house was built on a foundation of legal fictions. Amara's time with the Leclercs was the shortest of all. She lasted only 2 days. She did not stare at a wall or a garden. She stood in the judge's private study, her eyes fixed on the heavy iron safe where he kept his most sensitive documents. The judge found her there in the middle of the night, standing like a statue in the moonlight. He ordered her out, but she did not move. Enraged, he reached for his pistol, but before he could escalate the violence, his own son entered the room. The young man, curious about the strange woman's fixation, asked his father what was in the safe. The question hung in the air, heavy with a sudden, terrible intuition. The following morning, the judge's son, driven by a suspicion he could not articulate, stole the key and opened the safe. Inside, he found not money but a forged will, the document that had disinherited his cousins and diverted the family fortune to his father. The judge had stolen his legacy with the stroke of a pen, and the proof had been sitting in the iron box for a decade, silent until Amara's gaze made it scream. The confrontation between father and son was violent and final. The judge was exposed as a fraud, his reputation as a man of honor decimated by a single piece of paper. Amara was returned to the auction block within the hour. The judge did not even speak to the auctioneer. He simply left her there and fled the city. The pattern was now undeniable. 3 families, 3 secrets, 3 ruins. The legend of Amara had transcended the gossip of the rotunda and entered the realm of folklore. She was no longer just a woman. She was a curse, a wandering conscience that could not be bought, only rented at the cost of one's soul. And yet, the line of buyers did not diminish. It grew. By November 1851, the Red Ledger begins to look less like a sales record and more like a catalogue of social demolition. The entries accelerate, becoming a blur of transactions that span the breadth of Louisiana's aristocracy. A shipping magnate from Algiers buys her on a Tuesday and returns her on a Friday, after his wife discovers receipts for a secret gambling debt that had leveraged their entire fleet. A plantation owner from Pointe Coupée holds her for a week, only to have his entire labor force stop working in a spontaneous act of passive resistance that ends only when Amara is removed from the property. In each case, the chaos is preceded by her silence and her gaze. The accumulation of evidence from this period is staggering. Court records from 5 different parishes show a spike in divorce filings, disinheritance suits, and sudden bankruptcies that correlate perfectly with the dates of Amara's residency. Letters between the wives of these prominent men, preserved in dusty attics and historical societies, reveal a terrifying consistency. They speak of the Lady of the Ledger not with hatred, but with a strange, trembling awe. She does not sleep One wife wrote to her sister, "She stands in the hallways like a ghost of judgment. My husband cannot look at her, and because of that, I know he is hiding something." The sheer statistical impossibility of her returns began to attract attention beyond the circle of buyers. The auctioneer, Mure, tried to hide the pattern, using different aliases for her in the catalogue. The Nubian Beauty, the Silent Pearl, the St. Landry Gem, but the buyers knew. They recognized her not by her name, but by the stillness that surrounded her. The price continued to rise, driven by a perverse logic. If she destroyed the man before you, it was because he was weak. If you could tame her, if you could endure her presence without collapsing, you would prove yourself the ultimate patriarch, the man with no sins to hide. This hubris fed the cycle. A timber baron bought her and lost his business when a hidden stash of illegal contracts was discovered behind a painting she wouldn't stop looking at. A fiercely religious deacon bought her and was defrocked when his private journals, filled with blasphemous doubts and vices, were found under the floorboard beneath her feet. The evidence was irrefutable. Amara was a catalyst for the revelation of truth. She was a biological agent of transparency, introduced into a society built entirely on lies, repression, and the polite concealment of atrocities. The physical toll on Amara herself is never mentioned in the official sales documents, but private letters from house servants tell a different story. They describe her as growing thinner, her eyes burning with an increasing intensity, as if the burden of the secrets she was unearthing was consuming her from within. She was a vessel for the trauma of an entire state, absorbing the sins of her masters and reflecting them back with a blinding luminosity. The servants treated her with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons, leaving offerings of food and water that she barely touched. To them, she was not a slave. She was an avenging angel sent to balance the scales. The chaos reached such a fever pitch that the auction house considered banning her sale. Muir penned a letter to the city council asking for guidance on a property that seems to possess a malignant influence on the commerce of the city. He suggested she be sold out of state, sent north or to the Caribbean, anywhere far from New Orleans. But the council, comprised of men who were as arrogant as they were wealthy, refused. They argued that banning her would be an admission of superstition, a sign that the white elite feared a single enslaved woman. They demanded she remain on the block, a challenge to their own power. It was during this period of frenzied commerce that the nature of the secrets began to shift. Initially they were domestic, infidelities, thefts, lies, but as Amara moved through the highest echelons of power, the secrets became darker. She began to uncover crimes of blood, murders disguised as accidents, disappearances labeled as runaways, land thefts ratified by corrupt judges. She was moving closer to the rot at the core of the system, spiraling inward toward a truth that threatened not just individual families, but the legitimacy of the state itself. The Red Ledger shows one final entry before the ultimate sale. A wealthy widow, Madame Lalaury's cousin, purchased Amara in a bid to have a companion. It was the only time she was sold to a woman. The arrangement lasted 6 hours. The widow returned her the same afternoon, screaming that Amara had stood by the fireplace where the widow's late husband had died, staring into the flames. The widow, who had inherited everything, could not bear the implication of that gaze. She forfeited the entire purchase price, fleeing the rotunda as if pursued by furies. By December, Amara had been sold 12 times. She had destroyed 12 reputations, ended 4 marriages, and triggered 3 criminal investigations. She was the most dangerous object in Louisiana, a human bomb waiting for a detonator. And yet, the ultimate buyer was already making his way to New Orleans, a man who believed that he alone possessed the power to silence the past. He did not want a servant, he wanted to bury a memory, Amidst the swirling rumors and rising panic, a man of science attempted to rationalize the phenomenon. Dr. Julien Fortier, a Creole physician renowned for his studies on the nervous constitution of the enslaved population, requested permission to examine Amara during one of her brief interregnums at the hotel. His private casebook, a leather-bound volume filled with precise anatomical sketches and clinical notes, offers the first and only medical perspective on the woman who was terrorizing the aristocracy. Fortier approached the examination with the skepticism of a positivist, convinced that the curse was a mass hysteria induced by superstition and guilt. Fortier's notes from November 14, 1851, describe his initial encounter. "The subject presents no physical abnormalities," he wrote. "Heart rate is slow, remarkably steady, no signs of fever, palsy or mania. Her gaze, while direct, does not suggest the vacuity of the feeble-minded, but rather a hyper-awareness that is clinically disquieting." He attempted to engage her in conversation, to test her cognitive faculties, but she remained mute. It was only when he placed his hand on her shoulder to check for muscle rigidity that he recorded a strange physiological reaction. Upon contact, the subject's skin temperature appeared to drop, and I experienced a sudden, inexplicable vertigo, accompanied by a fleeting visual disturbance, a sensation of seeing smoke where there was none. Dr. Fortier, shaken but determined, formulated a hypothesis that was radical for his time. He posited that Amara was not the source of the chaos, but a passive reflector. In a letter to a colleague in Paris, he theorized, "It is my belief that this woman possesses a nervous sensitivity so acute that she acts as a mirror to the subconscious anxieties of those around her. She does not know their secrets. She merely resonates with the physiological suppression of their guilt. The men who buy her are not afraid of her. They are afraid of the reflection she offers. She is a biological divining rod for the concealed conscience." This mirror theory explains the specific nature of the events. Amara did not lead the wives to the hidden letters or the buried bodies. She simply gravitated toward the source of the tension in the house. When a man suppresses a crime, he creates a psychological void, a point of immense stress. Fortier argued that Amara was naturally drawn to these voids, standing near the physical evidence because that was where the psychic pressure was highest. She was not a witch. She was a symptom of a diseased society. Fortier's investigation took a darker turn when he began to interview the families who had returned her. He noted a common medical symptom among the patriarchs: acute insomnia, tremors of the hands, and a pronounced aversion to their own reflections. The men were suffering from what Fortier termed moral collapse. Their physical health deteriorated rapidly after owning Amara, as if the effort of maintaining their lies against her silent interrogation physically exhausted them. One former owner, he noted, had clawed his own eyes out in a fit of madness, screaming that he could still see her looking at him. The doctor's notes also reveal a disturbing detail about Amara's physical state. Despite being sold and moved repeatedly, despite being fed the meager rations of the auction house, she showed no signs of fatigue or malnutrition. "It is as if she is sustained by something other than bread," Fortier wrote in the margins of his journal. "She feeds on the revelations. With every family that falls, she appears stronger, more luminous. It is a parasitism of truth." This observation led Fortier to fear for his own safety. He abruptly ended his study after 3 days, claiming that he too had begun to see things in the shadows of his clinic, faces of patients he had failed to save, mistakes he had buried. Fortier's final entry on the subject is a warning that went unheeded. He advised the auctioneer Muir that Amara was medically incompatible with the institution of slavery. He argued that a slave must be a blank slate upon which the master writes his will. Amara, however, was a mirror that wrote the master's will back onto him. "You cannot own a reflection," Fortier warned. "If you try to grasp it, you will only cut your hands on the glass." The medical community dismissed Fortier's theories as fanciful, but his hypothesis remains the most compelling explanation for the events of 1851. It suggests that the horror was not supernatural in the traditional sense, but psychological. Amara was a weaponized empathy, a being who forced the repressed trauma of the slaveholding class to the surface. She was the inevitable counterbalance to a system that relied on absolute silence to survive. Dr. Fortier's casebook was archived and forgotten, only to be rediscovered decades later. But in the winter of 1851, his warning was just another whisper in a city deafened by the roar of commerce. The auction continued, the prices rose, and the mirror waited for the one man whose secrets were dark enough to shatter the glass completely. By December, the impact of Amara's presence had migrated from the ledgers of men to the parlors of women. The social fabric of Louisiana's elite, usually woven tight with protocol and decorum, began to fray. A network of correspondence between the wives, daughters, and sisters of the parish patriarchs reveals a shift in the narrative. To the men, Amara was a liability, a curse to be expelled. But to the women trapped in marriages defined by silence and deception, she became something else, a dangerous fascination. They began to call her the truth teller. The letters of Madame Delphine, a prominent socialite whose husband had narrowly avoided buying Amara, serve as a chronicle of this fracture. "The men are terrified," she wrote to her cousin in Natchez. "They speak of her as a witch, a demon. But I have seen the way the women look at her when she passes in the street. It is not fear in their eyes. It is hunger. They want to know. They want to know where the money goes, who the children in the village resemble, why the study door is always locked. She holds the keys that we have been denied." This whisper network transformed the market dynamics. Women began to subtly pressure their husbands to acquire Amara, feigning interest in her beauty or her domestic potential, while secretly hoping she would unlock the skeletons in their own closets. It was a high-stakes game of domestic espionage. To bring Amara into the house was to invite ruin, but for many women, the truth was worth the price of the estate. They were willing to burn down their own golden cages just to see what was hidden in the ashes. The fracture deepened along racial lines as well. The enslaved women of the households, the cooks, the maids, the nurses, formed their own conduit of information. They knew the secrets long before the white wives did, but they possessed no power to reveal them. Amara became their avatar. When she stood staring at a wall, the house servants would silently ensure that the mistress of the house accidentally entered the room at the right moment. It was a silent coalition of the oppressed, a coordinated effort to dismantle the master's house using his own purchase as the battering ram. The social season of 1851 collapsed under this tension. Balls were cancelled. Dinner parties were affairs of paranoid silence. No one knew who would be the next to fall. The Amara effect had created a climate of suspicion where every glance was interpreted as an accusation. Husbands began to view their wives as potential enemies, and wives viewed their husbands as strangers. The foundational trust of the patriarchy, that the women would accept the lies necessary to maintain their lifestyle, was broken. In the churches, the sermons began to address the spirit of discord plaguing the parish. Preachers railed against the sins of curiosity and the demon of division, urging their flocks to return to the ordained order. But the pews were filled with people who had seen the truth, and platitudes could not put the genie back in the bottle. Amara had proved that the divine order was a facade for human corruption. The spiritual authority of the church, which had long sanctioned the system of slavery, was being eroded by the revelation of the sins it protected. One particularly telling incident involved the wife of a wealthy banker who, after Amara exposed her husband's embezzlement of church funds, stood up in the middle of Sunday service and walked out, followed by her 3 daughters. It was a public rejection of the social contract. The banker was ruined within the week, but the image of his wife's departure lingered, a symbol of the women choosing truth over status. The records from this time show a spike in legal filings for separation of bed and board, a rare and scandalous step in 1851. The women were emboldened. The presence of Amara had given them a weapon, a precedent that the truth could be uncovered. Even after she left a household, the change remained. She left behind a legacy of scrutiny. The blindfold had been removed, and it could not be retied. As Christmas approached, the tension in New Orleans was palpable. The city was holding its breath, waiting for the final act. The red ledger lay open on the auctioneer's podium, lot 402 listed one last time. The community was fractured, the families divided, and the stage was set for the entry of a man who believed he was immune to the consequences of his history. Senator Leonidas Thorne was coming to buy the truth-teller, and he intended to silence her forever. On December 20th, 1851, the final sale of Amara took place, an event documented not just in the auction ledger, but in the political columns of the New Orleans Picayune. The buyer was Senator Leonidas Thorne, the Lion of St. Landry, a man whose political influence stretched from the bayou to Washington, D.C. Thorne was the archetype of the Southern power broker, wealthy, ruthless, and outwardly unimpeachable. He purchased Amara for the unprecedented sum of $8,000, a figure that silenced the room. But Thorne did not buy her for labor, nor for prestige. He bought her to break the legend. Thorne's motivation is laid bare in a letter to his campaign manager, written the night before the auction. "This superstition has gone on long enough," he wrote. "The fools of this city are frightened by a slave woman's stare. I will purchase her, I will break her spirit, and I will show these cowards that power resides in the will of the master, not the whims of the property. By Sunday she will be scrubbing my floors. By Monday the legend will be dead." It was an act of supreme arrogance, a public challenge to the curse that had claimed his peers. Thorne took Amara to Belle Terre, his vast plantation isolated in the swamps of St. Landry Parish. Belle Terre was a kingdom unto itself, a place where Thorne's word was law and the outside world was held at bay by miles of black water and cypress trees. The estate was rumored to be built on land that had been acquired under dubious circumstances decades earlier, but no record of the transaction existed in the parish archives that Thorne himself controlled. Upon her arrival at Belle Terre, the atmosphere of the plantation shifted instantly. The overseers, brutal men hand-picked by Thorne, reported a sudden unease among the field hands. "The work song stopped," one overseer recorded in the plantation log. "The silence is louder than the singing." Thorne, determined to prove his dominance, ordered Amara to serve dinner in the main dining room on her first night. He invited his political allies to witness his triumph. The dinner was a disaster of historic proportions. Witnesses recounted that as Amara poured the wine, she stopped behind the chair of the parish sheriff, a key ally of Thorne's. She did not pour, she simply stood. The sheriff, a man known for his violent temper, began to sweat profusely. He choked on his food, gasping for air as if an invisible hand were crushing his throat. He fled the table, knocking over his chair. Thorne, enraged, ordered Amara to leave, but she turned her gaze on him. For the first time, the senator felt the cold fire that Dr. Fortier had described. The irrefutable evidence of Thorne's vulnerability came 2 days later. Thorne found Amara standing in the ruins of an old sharecropper's cabin on the edge of his property, land that was supposedly fallow. She was staring at the ground. Thorne ordered her dragged away, but the spot she had marked could not be ignored. His wife, Eleanor Thorne, who had watched the arrival of the witch with deep trepidation, walked to the site after Thorn had left. There, half buried in the mud, was a charred timber post, the remains of a house that had been burned to the ground. Eleanor knew the history that her husband had tried to erase. The land of Belterre had not always been theirs. It had belonged to the Cavalier family, a clan of free people of color who had farmed the rich soil for a generation before Thorn arrived. They had disappeared overnight in 1825, their land absorbed into the Thorn estate by a sale that no one had witnessed. The charred timber was the physical proof of the fire that had consumed them. Thorn's reaction to Amara's presence was not the guilt of the previous owners. It was the fury of a predator exposed. He realized that Amara was not just a passive mirror. She was a pointer. She was guiding the eyes of the living to the graves of the dead. The sheer specificity of her knowledge, locating the exact site of the Cavalier homestead in 1,000 acres of swamp, was impossible, unless she remembered. The impact on Thorn was rapid deterioration. His journals from this week show a descent into paranoia. He began carrying a pistol in his own home. He fired the overseers, believing they were conspiring with the woman. He stopped sleeping. The Lion of St. Landry was being hunted in his own den, not by a pack of wolves, but by a silent woman who refused to look away. The irrefutable evidence was no longer just a ledger or a letter. It was the land itself, crying out against him. The collapse of authority at Belterre was total and swift. By the fourth day, the plantation had ceased to function as an economic unit. The enslaved population, sensing the shift in power, engaged in a silent mutiny. Orders were misunderstood, tools were lost, gates were left open. The hierarchy of fear that Thorn had meticulously constructed was dissolving because the source of the fear had shifted. The master was afraid, and his fear was contagious. The domestic sphere collapsed first. Eleanor Thorn, a woman who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of willful ignorance, crossed the Rubicon. She stopped sharing a bed with her husband. Instead, she began to spend her days in the sewing room where Amara had been confined. The servants reported hearing Eleanor talking for hours, not interrogating, but confessing. She spoke of the nightmares she had endured, the screams she had heard years ago and pretended were the wind. Amara listened, her silence acting as a vacuum that drew the poison out of Eleanor's soul. The collapse extended to the staff. The head housekeeper, a formidable woman named Sarah who had served the Thorns for decades, stopped enforcing the senator's rules. She unlocked the pantry, she allowed the field hands extra rations, and most dangerously, she allowed Amara to walk freely through the house at night. Thorn found himself a prisoner in his own library, the only room where he felt safe, drinking heavily and drafting legal documents to have Amara committed to an asylum. But the most significant collapse was internal. Thorn's political network began to fracture. The sheriff, humiliated at the dinner, refused to return to Belterre. The judge who ratified Thorn's land deals sent a messenger claiming illness. The senator's power relied on the projection of invulnerability, and Amara had pierced that armor. Without his allies, Thorn was just a man with a stolen farm and a guilty conscience. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the tension broke. Thorn, in a drunken rage, attempted to strike Amara with his cane in the hallway. Sarah, the housekeeper, intercepted the blow, an act of defiance punishable by death. But Thorn did not strike her. He froze. Standing behind Sarah were his wife, his 2 daughters, and the entire house staff. They formed a wall of silent resistance. It was a visual representation of his absolute loss of authority. The patriarch stood alone against the women of his world, and they were no longer afraid of him. Thorn retreated to his study, locking the door. The sound of the lock clicking shut was the death knell of his reign. He was no longer the master of Belterre. He was an occupier in a hostile territory. The authority had transferred to the collective, to the coalition of women who had found their courage in the reflection of Amara's eyes. That night, the house was silent, but it was not asleep. The women were moving. The collapse of the old order had created the space for a new action, a desperate gambit to end the tyranny once and for all. The documents record that candles burned in the sewing room until dawn. They were not sewing clothes. They were stitching together a revolution. In the early hours of Christmas morning, the pivotal discovery was made, not by chance, but by direction. Eleanor Thorne, guided by a gesture from Amara, went to the attic of the main house. There, hidden inside the lining of an old military greatcoat that had belonged to Thorne's father, she found the Cavalier deed. It was the original Spanish land grant given to the Cavalier family in 1790, a document that proved their legal ownership of the land Belle Terre stood on. But wrapped inside the deed was something far more damning, a handwritten confession by Thorne's father, dated 1825. The old man, perhaps fearing divine judgment in his final days, had written down the truth of the acquisition. He detailed how he and his son, Leonidas, had set fire to the Cavalier cabin while the family slept inside. He listed the names of the victims: Pierre Cavalier, his wife Marie, and their 7 children. The note ended with a chilling postscript. The youngest child, a girl of 5, ran into the swamp. We could not find her. We assume the gators took her. The realization hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. Amara was not a stranger. She was the girl who ran. She was the survivor of the massacre that had founded the Thorne dynasty. She had not been bought by Thorne. She had returned to the scene of the crime. Her entire journey through the auction block, her silence, her unearthly patience, it was all a long, circuitous road back to this specific house, to this specific coat, to this specific truth. The document changed everything. It transformed the conflict from a domestic dispute into a criminal conspiracy involving murder and grand larceny. It proved that Senator Thorne was not just a cruel master, but a murderer and a usurper. The title to the land was void. His fortune was illegitimate. Every dollar he possessed was fruit of the poisonous tree. Eleanor showed the documents to Sarah and the daughters. The women looked at the yellowed paper, then at the senator's study door, then at Amara. The mystery of her impossible nature was solved. She was not a supernatural entity. She was a witness with a perfect memory, waiting for the moment when the evidence could be found. Her power was the power of the survivor. The discovery presented a terrifying dilemma. To reveal the documents was to destroy the family, to plunge them all into poverty and scandal. But to hide them was to become complicit in the massacre. Eleanor looked at her daughters, then at Amara. The choice was between the comfort of a lie and the ruin of the truth. Amara did not pressure her. She simply stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the swamp that had hidden her for 25 years. Eleanor made her choice. She took the documents and placed them in a waterproof oilskin pouch. She was done protecting the name of Thorne. The source had been found, and now it had to be weaponized. While Eleanor plotted in the attic, Senator Thorne was making his own plans in the study. His personal diary, the final entry dated December 25th, 1851, reveals the cold calculation of a man backed into a corner. "The situation is untenable," he wrote in his sharp, angular script. "The woman knows. I see it in her eyes. She is the Cavalier whelp. I should have hunted her down in the swamp myself 20 years ago. She has turned my own house against me. There is no selling her now. She is too dangerous to let live. She is a contagion." Thorne outlined his plan with forensic detachment. He would stage a hunting accident. He would take Amara into the swamp under the pretense of punishing her for an infraction. There, deep in the cypress groves, he would end the threat. "A bullet is a final silence," he wrote. "I will tell Eleanor she tried to run, that she attacked me. The sheriff will corroborate. The law is mine." The justification in Thorne's mind was absolute. He viewed himself as the defender of his civilization. In his warped morality, the survival of his lineage justified any crime. Amara was not a human being to him. She was an existential threat, a flaw in the ledger that needed to be erased. The entry ends with a chilling resolve. "At dawn, I will correct the error." But Thorne had underestimated the intelligence network of his own household. Sarah, who had been listening at the door, heard the click of the gun being loaded. She relayed the information to Eleanor. The timeline had collapsed. They could not wait for the courts or the slow grind of justice. If Amara was still in the house at sunrise, she would be dead. The decision for decisive action was immediate. The women formed a plan that relied on the very invisibility they had been forced to endure. They would not fight Thorne physically. They would dismantle him bureaucratically and socially before he could pull the trigger. They would use the Night of the 7 letters. Eleanor wrote 7 identical letters, attaching copies of the confession and the deed to each. She addressed them to the governor, the bishop, the editor of the Picayune, the federal marshal in New Orleans, and 3 of Thorne's greatest political rivals. The plan required 7 riders to leave the plantation simultaneously in different directions. Thorne could stop 1, perhaps 2, but he could not stop 7. The suspense of that night was agonizing. The house was a powder keg. Thorne sat in his study, drinking courage for the murder he planned to commit. Upstairs, the women prepared the packages. Outside, the stable hands, alerted by Sarah, quietly saddled the fastest horses. It was a conspiracy of the righteous, a unified front of white and black women, servants and mistresses, working together to save the life of the one woman who had saved their souls. The most poignant document of the entire saga is not a diary or a deed, but the testimony of the stable boy, young Marcus, given to a federal inquiry years later. He described the scene at 3:02 a.m. on December 26th. "The moon was high," he testified. "The mistress Eleanor came down to the stables herself. She didn't look like a rich lady that night. She looked like a soldier. She handed us the oilskin packets and said, 'Ride like the devil is chasing you, because he is.'" As the riders thundered out of the gates, the noise woke Thorne. He rushed to the window, pistol in hand, and saw the 7 shadows scattering into the darkness. He fired a shot into the night, a futile gesture against the inevitability of his ruin. He knew instantly what had happened. The information was out. The quarantine was broken. Thorne ran to the sewing room to kill Amara immediately, abandoning the pretense of the accident. He kicked down the door, screaming her name. But the room was empty. The window was open, the curtains fluttering in the cold wind. On the floor lay a single object. The iron shackles he had bought for her, unlocked and arranged in a perfect circle. There was no footprint on the rug, no sign of struggle. Amara had simply vanished. The interpretation of this moment has divided historians. The skeptics argue she climbed out the window and fled into the swamp she knew so well. The romantics believe she dissolved into the mist, her purpose fulfilled. But the symbolism was clear. The chains were empty because they could never truly hold her. She had been the captor, not the captive. Thorne spent the remaining hours of darkness pacing the empty room. He knew that by noon the riders would reach their destinations. The telegraph lines would hum with the news of his crimes. The marshals would be on their way. The facade of the Lion of Saint Landry had been stripped away, leaving only the arsonist and the murderer. At dawn, the time he had appointed for Amara's death, a single gunshot rang out from the study. The servants did not rush to investigate. They knew Thorne had passed the final sentence on himself. The fallout from the Night of the 7 letters was cataclysmic. The New Orleans Picayune ran the story on the front page. Senator exposed. The Horror of Belle Terre. The publication of the confession and the deeds led to the immediate seizure of the Thorn estate. The scandal implicated dozens of officials who had looked the other way, triggering a purge of the state's political machine that lasted for a decade. Eleanor Thorn and her daughters were left destitute but free. They moved to a modest house in the French Quarter. Eleanor never spoke of her husband again, but she kept the oilskin pouch on her mantelpiece, a reminder of the night she found her voice. The Cavalier land was eventually auctioned off by the state, the proceeds used to found an orphanage. A grim irony that perhaps would have amused the senator. The Red Ledger became a cursed artifact. Jean-Baptiste Mur burned it in 1852, claiming it brought bad luck, but a clerk had made a copy, preserving the record of the impossible sales. The families that had owned Amara, the Duguays, the Fonteneaus, the Leclercs, never recovered their former glory. They carried the stain of the Amara curse for generations, their names synonymous with hidden shame. But the most lasting consequence was the legend of Amara herself. She was never seen again in Louisiana. No bounty hunter ever picked up her trail. No grave bears her name. She became a ghost story told to children, a warning that the truth has eyes and can walk through walls. In the slave quarters, she became a folk hero, a mythic figure who could topple masters without lifting a hand. They sang songs about the silent lady who broke the chains with her stare. Her legacy was not one of violence, but of revelation. She proved that the foundations of the South's power were built on sand, on lies, thefts, and murders that could not withstand the light of day. She was the first crack in the dam that would eventually burst in the Civil War. Decades later, in 1920, a young historian researching the Antebellum South in Paris stumbled upon a photograph in a dusty antique shop. It was a daguerreotype dated 1895, taken at a salon in Paris. The subject was a woman of striking beauty, wearing the crest of the Cavalier family on a brooch. She looked exactly as Amara was described in 1851. Unaged, regal, her gaze fixed directly on the lens with an unsettling intensity. The historian bought the photo, trembling. If the date was correct, the woman would have been nearly 80 years old, yet she looked no older than 25. Was it Amara? Or a descendant? Or was it simply a trick of the light? A coincidence that desperate minds cling to? The photograph now hangs in a private collection, nameless. But those who know the story of the Red Ledger cannot look at it for long. They say that if you stare into her eyes in the picture, you begin to remember things you have tried to forget. You begin to feel the cold draft of the rotunda. You begin to worry about the secrets in your own walls. Amara vanished from the records, but she never truly left. She exists in the silence that follows a lie. She exists in the fear of the powerful when they hear a floorboard creak. The impossible secret was not that she was sold 12 times. It was that she was never really for sale at all. She was the bill coming due, and somewhere perhaps the ledger is still open. History is filled with empty shackles and burned diaries, fragments of truth that survive the fires of those who try to erase them. If you believe that justice is a force that transcends time and that the past is never truly dead, join our community. Subscribe to Before the Story. Hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs to know the truth. The archives are deep, and we have only just begun to dig. See you in the next investigation.